The Case of the Extraordinary Ordinary Man, James H. Stroman. Earl Stanley Gardner, prolific author of the Perry Mason series of crime novels, was considered by Jim to be the greatest author of all time. Join us now for the most recent Perry Mason episode, The Case of the Extraordinary Ordinary Man. Our story begins when Perry Mason receives a phone call letting him know about the passing of his greatest reader, James Henry Stroman. Mr. Stroman, an author himself, had read every Perry Mason novel multiple times throughout his 95 years. Perry Mason was distracted by this phone call. He wanted to know more about his greatest reader. Who was James Stroman, and what was so extraordinary about this ordinary man? James H. Stroman was born in 1925 in Kingston, Oklahoma, a small town near the site of present-day Lake Texoma. He graduated from Kingston High School, where he was valedictorian in his class. Upon graduation, World War II was raging, and Jim was drafted into the U.S. Army. Jim was stationed in Boston, Massachusetts, where he served as an office clerk to an Army general who was in charge of the defense of the East Coast. While in Boston in the Army, Jim attended night school classes at Harvard. And while in the Army, Jim met his lifelong friend Dave Johnson. After losing touch after the war, Dave tracked Jim down many years later and introduced Jim to Dave's wife, Regine. They also became friends. This led to friendships with Dave's children and even his grandchildren. And while stationed in Boston, Jim was welcomed into the home of a wealthy Boston family as part of the USO's Adopt a Soldier program. The family treated Jim to fabulous dinners in their home on the weekends. And at the end of the war, when Jim was discharged and prepared to go home, the family gifted Jim with a car. Following World War II, Jim continued his college education at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree. While attending SMU, Jim took an English class from a professor who had created her own self-printed grammar handout to be used by students. At one point, Jim asked his teacher, "Why don't you publish this?" To which she replied, "Why don't you take it and publish it?" Later, after Jim had been working as an executive administrative assistant, Jim authored The Secretary's Manual. This book, published by Signet in 1968, became the top secretarial reference in the country and went through over 15 printings. In 1988, with the book now obsolete, Jim worked with his nephew Kevin and his niece Jennifer to rewrite the book and add modern office technology and procedures. The result was the Administrative Assistants and Secretary's Handbook, published by the American Management Association. The book soon became the top reference for administrative assistants and is used in college and junior college courses as a textbook. The book has been revised and rewritten 5 times and is currently published by HarperCollins. The book is also popular internationally and even has a version available in Chinese. Perry Mason remembers seeing this secretary's manual in the shelf in the case of the terrified typist. Now he was beginning to see the connections, and he wanted to know more. Flashback to after Jim graduated from SMU, a great opportunity came around in the mid-1950s to join Oklahoma Governor Raymond Gary as his personal administrative assistant. Jim worked in the governor's office at the Oklahoma Capitol building and managed the governor's appointments, calls, and correspondence. At one point, the governor issued honorary credentials to Jim and his family. Everyone became an honorary Oklahoma colonel. Once, while sitting at his desk, Jim looked up to see a large entourage of people approaching the governor's office. It was President Truman arriving for a surprise visit. He said he was just passing through and wanted to speak to the governor. Jim told him that the governor was meeting with his transportation committee down the hall. "I'll go get him for you," Jim told the president. Truman responded, "I'll go with you." Jim and President Truman walked down the hall together, and Jim peeked his head into the committee meeting. He told the governor, "President Truman's here to see you," to which the governor shockingly replied, "What? Where is he?" "Well, right here," said Jim, and then opened the door a bit more so Truman could peek inside. Another time, a visiting senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, came for a visit. Jim arranged for lunch to be served, and the governor invited Jim to eat with them. Jim remembers Kennedy asking the governor for his support for a possible run for president. Just as Earl Stanley Gardner's novels made it to television as The Perry Mason Show, The Case of the Extraordinary Ordinary Man also involves brushes with the silver screen. One of the highlights of Jim's time with the governor was the premiere of the movie musical Oklahoma. The premiere was coordinated by the Oklahoma Governor's Office. Jim's date for the evening was Natalie Wood, who he described as charming and friendly. During the premiere party, Jim met many different movie stars. Later, a popular movie fan magazine published a story with Jim's picture titled "Someday He Will Come," which focused on who Natalie was dating and who she might marry. Jim kept in touch with Natalie, and many years later he was invited to her house where he met her husband, Robert Wagner. At the end of Governor Raymond Gary's term, Jim was invited to go to Washington, where he became a White House Fellow with John F. Kennedy, who did indeed run for president and won. The next episode of his life sent Jim back to Dallas, where he accepted a position as the administrative assistant to Clint Murchison, who owned the Dallas Cowboys. During his over 10 years in this job, the entire family went to dozens of Dallas Cowboy football games and enjoyed 50-yard line seats. Jim met many members of the Cowboys organization as they came for meetings with the owner, including Coach Tom Landry and quarterback Roger Staubach. He was also friends with Tex Schramm, the general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, and they continued to correspond via letters for many years. At one point, the team gave Jim an autographed football. Every member of the team signed it, including players that went on to become famous NFL coaches, such as Mike Ditka and Dan Reeves. One story Jim recalled was when President Lyndon Johnson called and wanted to speak with his boss, Clint. After a short time, Clint called Jim into his office and gave Jim a paper sack and asked Jim to drive it over and deliver it to an office across town. Jim did, and on the way, he peeked inside the sack. It was filled with cash. Apparently, this is how political campaigns were financed back then. This relationship with LBJ led to an autographed picture from President Johnson and his family, as well as an autographed copy of Johnson's book. The autograph, perhaps remembering the cash campaign donation, says, "To Jim Stroman, a can-do man who works for a fellow who believes man can. With appreciation, Lyndon Johnson." While he had this great job working for the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, Jim was very generous with his family, buying a home that he shared with his mother and father on Lakeshore Drive. After his father died, Jim supported his mother until her death. He also bought a home for his sister Ruth and sent money every month to his grandmother and his uncle. While working as Clint Murchison's administrative assistant, Jim met many famous people who he established personal relationships with, including actors and actresses like Olivia de Havilland, Art Linkletter, Donna Douglas, Denver Pyle, Michael Learned, Burgess Meredith, Loretta Young, and George Hamilton, and singers like Patti Page, and politicians including Richard Nixon, Lloyd Benson, George Wallace, and Ross Perot. Throughout the years, being an avid cook and recipe collector, Jim published many cookbooks, including Dining Out at Home, Down Home Texas Cooking, From Texas Kitchens, The Great Country Inns of America Cookbook, Country Inn Cooking, and Prize Recipes from Great Restaurants. His books are still available on Amazon and even at Walmart. After his job ended with the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, Jim took a brief job in California with the president of Pepperdine University as his administrative assistant. He also got some experience as an entrepreneur with several of his own businesses, including Brake Guard, a car safety device, Ritterroach, a non-toxic pest control, and Stroman Foods, marketing Jim's award-winning chili seasonings. During this time, Jim lived with his sister Ruth and her husband John, and they took care of Jim's mother Lillian in Campbell, Texas, about 50 miles from Dallas. One of Jim's favorite pastimes then was gardening, and each year over an acre of vegetables were planted and harvested. Family gatherings at holidays usually featured meals with something fresh from the garden. Jim eventually obtained a real estate broker's license, and he sold homes in Houston and condos in Dallas. For several years, Jim took a job as a telemarketer for Sears selling home improvement solutions. Being quite a talker, telemarketing came easy and Jim was given the Top Salesman Award repeatedly. Jim eventually moved to Atlanta where he rejoined his sister Ruth and her husband John. One adventure that brought back many memories for Jim was a tour we took of the governor's mansion in Atlanta on Ruth's birthday. As John and Ruth's health declined, Jim became their primary caregiver, even though he was already in his 80s. When John and Ruth passed, Jim continued to live alone for a year, enjoying a small container garden on the deck, occasional restaurant adventures, and shopping trips. Jim eventually decided to move to Azalea Manor in order to enjoy the company of others. Jim made a lot of friends at Azalea with both residents and the staff. And when he was able, Jim enjoyed going out to get Mexican food, which was one of his favorites, especially on his birthday. Perry Mason's investigation into the case of the extraordinary ordinary man ended on January 13, 2021, with James Stroman's passing. But Perry Mason learned a lot about his most prolific reader. It was the story of a man who had brushes with the famous and the politically powerful, dated movie stars, a man who supported his family even when it meant spending his last dollar on others instead of himself, a man who accomplished a lot, author of 14 published books, businessman and entrepreneur, caregiver to the sick and ailing, a World War II veteran, and a friend to many. Even though he thought of himself as an ordinary man, you can now see what Perry Mason saw in this life story. Jim Stroman was an extraordinary, ordinary man, and we are all blessed to have played a role in his story.